Ben Renshaw was trained as a classical violinist, and he was trained from childhood. He later toured the world and played before large crowds. He had an extraordinary talent, and people loved his music. But in spite of his success, both musically and financially, he wasn't happy. Something was missing. He didn't really know what it was, but it was weighing on him, and he just didn't feel fulfilled in life, and he actually felt like he was wasting his time. He needed something. At the time, he didn't know what it was. He was going to go on a quest, a life journey, if you will, to find out what that missing component in life was. It was one thing that once he did find it, it made all the difference in the world. And it's the same one thing that I believe the Israelites were missing when they left Egypt and were about to enter the Promised Land. If you join me over in Numbers chapter 13, Numbers 13, and we'll pick up the story. You're familiar with the story of God telling Moses to send men into the land of Canaan to spy out the land. That story begins in Numbers 13, verse 1. We know they went into the land and they saw clusters of grapes. They had to carry them between two men on a pole. There were evidently so many of them. They found figs and pomegranates, a very lush land flowing with milk and honey. And they returned 40 days later. We know the story. Joshua and Caleb were ready to go. Let's go conquer this land. Verse 30, Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, "Let us go up at once and take possession, for we are well able to overcome it." But we know that the other 10, quote, leaders of the tribes, were of a different mind. Down in verse 33, it says, "We saw giants. The descendants of Anak came from the giants, and we were like grasshoppers in their sight." And so they were very discouraged at the prospect of entering into the land. And they passed that discouragement on to those whom they led as well. You notice in Numbers 14, verse 1 talks about the people wept that night. And in verse 2, it goes on to say the congregation spoke against Moses and Aaron. They said, "If only we had died in the land of Egypt, or if only we had died in the wilderness. Why did the Lord bring us to this land to fall by the sword, and that our wives and children should become victims? Would it not be better for us to return to Egypt?" And so they said to one another, "Let us select a leader and return to Egypt." Now we're familiar with the story. Notice how dire it is that the Lord brought us out to kill us all and to kill all our wives and children. What were they missing? What were they missing? What was that one component that's so important that they were missing, that had they had it, they would have been able to go into the land and conquer the land? Now, some of you may be thinking, well, they lacked faith. And that's true. They did lack faith. But the thing that I'm proposing today that they were missing actually wasn't faith, though they were missing faith. Had they had this one thing, I believe they could have had the faith they needed. But because they were missing this one component that's so important in our lives, they could not have the faith that they needed to enter the land. No, they did not. If you go back to Exodus chapter 32, we have the story of the golden calf. And I'm going to turn here because I think it is an example showing that Moses had this. Moses had it. He got the picture, but they didn't. Let's pick up then in Exodus 32, verse 9. Exodus 32, verse 9. The Lord said to Moses, "I have seen this people, and indeed it is a stiff-necked people. Now therefore let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them. And I will make of you a great nation." I think this was partly a test for Moses. God, I think, wanted to see how Moses would respond to this just a tremendous accolade. Wow, you're going to make my descendants the nation. Rather than it just be Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, it can be Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Moses' descendants. It had to be quite an honor, but we know Moses, being at that time in his life at least a very humble man, he rejected that. He was thinking big picture. He wasn't just thinking what I can get out of it. He was thinking about how this would reflect on God and what God had promised. Notice verse 11, Moses pleaded with the Lord his God and said, Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people whom you have brought out of the land of Egypt with great power and with a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians speak and say, he brought them out to harm them, to kill them in the mountains, to consume them from the face of the earth? Turn from your fierce wrath and relent from this harm to your people. So he didn't accept the bait, if you will. He passed the test, and he is speaking very maturely, very calmly and patiently. And notice verse 13. This gets to the core, I think, of what Moses recognized and what he had. He said, remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants, to whom you swore by your own self and said to them, I will multiply your descendants as the stars of heaven. And all this land which I have spoken of, I give to your descendants, and they shall inherit it forever. So the Lord relented from the harm which he said he would do to his people. Moses had this one thing. And we see it from this statement because he goes back and he reminds God of the promise he made. And Moses was completely convicted that they were going to inherit that land. God was giving them the land because he had made this promise. So Moses had this one thing that others didn't have. Ben Renshaw, the violinist, he had to go out, embark on a personal journey to discover. And what he discovered was two things. For one, he discovered, as he says, who he really was. And I talked last week about the concept of our identity. I know some of you were at camp last week, but I talked about that, and this sermon is intended to go hand in hand with that one. But I talked about the idea that when we know who we are, and I don't mean our name, but we know who we are in terms of our identity. God has called us to be his children. And when we primarily identify as children of God, that changes the way we see things. It changes our life because we want to act as a child of God in everything we do. I couldn't help think, as I was preparing this, that in today's world, how do people identify? This is a big thing right now. The most important thing you identify today in the world is either your sexuality or your gender. Now, I don't intend to poke fun at anyone, but how trivial is that in the grand scheme of things? If that is your identity, if that's who you are, your basic core, if as deep as it can get is whether you're a boy or a girl or something else, or what you prefer sexually. If that's the core, if that's how deep it goes. But that, it seems to be how deep it goes with many, because it is a big deal. That is their identity. So our identity is children of God, God's very family. We'll talk a little bit more about that today. But I also talked about if we see God for his identity, who he really is, his greatness, his glory, his majesty, it changes us as well, because we have an intense desire to please him, to serve him, to obey him. And so it changes us, changes the way we are, the way we think about things. The second thing that Ben Renshaw did is on this journey to find out what was missing, is he found purpose. He found purpose. And in finding that purpose, it changed his life. He realized that his purpose was in dealing and working with people, as he puts it, developing people. And this new purpose that he had found, it changed his life. It had a huge impact on him. He found a sense of fulfillment then in what he was doing. He changed what he was doing. Back last year, he wrote a book entitled Purpose: The Extraordinary Benefits of What Matters Most. And in that book, he wrote that he believes that personal purpose provides an anchor, a sense of meaning, and a clear focus in a destructive environment. He also writes that following your purpose helps you make a difference in the world. I referred to this yesterday in my Sabbath update that I sent out. We have the opportunity to make a difference in this world. Israel had that opportunity as well. I think Moses saw that God had a purpose for Israel. He'd made a promise, and he was going to fulfill it. He had a purpose. He had something he wanted them to accomplish, and he was going to make sure they did. He was going to help them in that. But Israel, oh, they missed their purpose. For all they cared, they could go back to Egypt and be slaves. Their lives had no more purpose than to just exist. No more meaning than just to be slaves. They were content with that. They didn't see that God had a purpose for them that was well beyond being slaves in Egypt. And they missed it. Because they missed it, I think they lacked the faith. What if they had realized, and I think they realized, I think they knew about the promises and all, but it just wasn't driving them. It wasn't changing the way they were thinking about things. If they had thought about the fact, as Moses did, God has made a promise. He has promised us this land. He will help us get it. We can have faith because God will be faithful. We have a purpose. We as a nation are called by God with a purpose. So He will help us. Had they had that sense of purpose, I think they would have had the faith they needed to have. And sometimes it's hard to have faith without a deep sense of purpose. God was going to give them the land, create a nation, an example nation for all the world. If they would obey Him, they would be an example. Jesus Christ would eventually come from that, and the whole world would be blessed through Abraham. God had a purpose for Israel, but they did not see that purpose. Today I'd like to talk about purpose. It is vital for us as God's people to have an unshakable sense of purpose. Both the reason we exist as a human being and the reason we sit here today in God's church. So I ask these questions. How strong is your sense of purpose? And how much does that sense of purpose drive you? How much does it affect the decisions you make in life? You know, for thousands of years, there were brilliant philosophers who tried to talk about and discern the meaning of life. Why are we here? And they had some ideas all over the place, but they tried to discern that because to them, having meaning was important. And it is important to be able to know why something is. Mr. Frank's letter that he wrote this week to the members, he wrote about why we are conducting leadership programs in the church. And I'll just quote from his letter. He says that business and organizational guru Simon Sinek is the author of the book Start With Why. His premise is that every organizational leader, before starting a program, should always ask why, forcing himself to consider the purpose behind his actions. He says, when you first came into the church, you were challenged with this question of why. One of the earlier books produced by the church was titled, Why Were You Born? Articles in the early magazines used this technique of asking, why do men suffer? Why do we keep the Feast of Tabernacles? Why be baptized in water? Why do we eat unleavened bread? Why marriage? Why did Christ die? He goes on to say probably one of the most famous why was repeated at the feast each year. Why are we here? Why are you here? The question of why is very important. And all of us should be able to answer the question very quickly, very easily. I think we can. But again, the question is, how much does that purpose drive us and impact us? It was interesting. Alan sent me an article this week from the UK where they measured the meaninglessness of the lives of young people. If you were to guess what percentage of young people in the UK consider life to be meaningless and without purpose, what would you think? Meaningless, and life is meaningless and without purpose. So those between the ages of 18 and 29, the Gen Zers, 89%, 9 out of 10 young people, 18 to 29, believe their lives are meaningless and without purpose in the UK. That struck me as much higher than I thought it would be. And what struck me as well is one of the primary reasons that they believe their life is is meaningless is the lack of finances. Now that strikes me as a little funny because in researching this sermon, I read in various places where men who had become tremendously successful, or individuals, I should say, who had become tremendously successful and thought that that would bring them both happiness and purpose, they said it didn't. Finances wasn't the key. So here we have 9 out of 10 young people in the UK who feel life is meaningless and they feel it would be meaningful if they just had money, stuff, and things. And they don't realize that doesn't bring meaning into life. It may help in some ways, but it doesn't bring purpose. It doesn't give that ultimate sense of fulfillment. So they're going to pursue something. They're not going to be able to attain it because they don't know how to get it. They don't know how to find that purpose. I have to wonder as well, what's going through the minds? What kind of purpose does someone who would go into a crowd and shoot them up have? These mass murders that we heard about this week, and as I mentioned in my Sabbath update, depending on how you define mass shootings, as many as 1.2 mass shootings takes place every day. We just don't hear about it because not everything can make the news. This week it did. What kind of life did these individuals have? How much meaning, how much purpose do you think they felt in life? Many of the shooters turned the gun on themselves or put themselves in a position to be killed by the police. We will never know, really. But I can't help thinking that they probably don't have a real sense of purpose. And if they do have a purpose, really, did they fulfill it by doing that? Even if they believe they have some kind of purpose, to stop immigration, as one of them apparently was upset about so many people coming into the country from the southern border. I don't think he did anything to stop that. What kind of purpose did he really fulfill? I remember thinking about this early on in my life. I don't think I mentioned it last week when I introduced myself, but my family, my mom and dad came into the church when I was 4. And my grandparents had come into the church the year before that when I was 3. So most of my life I remember being in the church. A few memories. I do have a memory of giving out Halloween candy before we came into the church. But our family really didn't do a lot with Christmas and Easter and that kind of thing as I was younger. So my life, most of my remembrances are in the church. And I remember from an early age, especially when I was an early teenager, I remember feeling that sense of purpose. And I think the reason why was because we talked about it. It's something that my parents would talk about with us, something that we heard about at church, and it's something that was preached, and it's something that we really, as teenagers, received a lot of at camp. I went to SEP, as I mentioned, for a number of years, and I remember that being a major focus for the teens and for the young people there at camp. What is your why? What is your purpose? Why has God brought you here? And they would point us forward to the future. And I remember thinking, I'm excited about my future. I'm not excited about that tribulation thing, but beyond that, I'm excited about that. And I remember the camp directors, we had several that came through in those days. I remember being told that one day, you will be the camp directors. And I thought, yeah, right. And, later on, of course, I thought that was strange because I ended up being a camp director. But I remembered him for those years saying that. And, of course, the way I took it was, yeah, someday in the millennium, after Christ comes back, I'm going to get to work with young people like I was. And that kind of inspired me. I saw some purpose in staying with the church. I never really had a desire to leave it, even though I had interests that were outside the church. I never had a desire to leave it because they had instilled in me that sense of purpose that went beyond anything that I could find out there. And so that stayed with me since my early days. And I don't believe, if you read books on discovering your purpose and things down that line, oftentimes they will ask you questions for you to basically think about your interests, Think about what motivates you. I have a list, in fact, from this Ben Renshaw in his book called Purpose. He does this. He asks us to turn inward rather than outward to discover our purpose. He says, turn inward. He doesn't use that word, but I'll read to you the list here. Think about this. If this were the way we discover our purpose, do you think you could really discover your purpose? He says, think back to the peak moments in your life when you were at your best. Then think about what was happening, an activity like a sport, a relationship that you had. Then identify the key themes that are shared across those peak moments. Then group those themes into a broader categories like helping people or making change happen. Then identify a category that seems to stand out above the others. Then ask a trusted person to help you explore those standout themes. What does it mean to you and why? Then ask them to take this information, summarize it to a potential purpose for you. And then finally, point number 8, clarify the initial purpose statement that means something to you. So you basically have gone back into your memories, find the peak moments, what were you doing, what made you happy, what made you fulfilled, and then defining your purpose based on that. Now, having said that, I think that there's tremendous value for our young people to find out what it is they have interests in terms of developing a career and choosing a career and a course for your college education. I think aptitude tests can be very effective. I think it's important to find something you can do that you enjoy doing. But you see, for many people in this world, that is their purpose. That's as deep as purpose goes. To me, that was what I did. My career was what I did. It wasn't my purpose. And I think it's unique for us in the church because we recognize there's something much deeper than what we do. Whether you're in plumbing, whether you're in electrical, whether you work with computers, we all know that God can help develop us into what He wants us to be, no matter what we're doing. And so we don't have to, though we want to do something we enjoy, we don't have to consider that as our purpose, as our mission in life. We don't have to do that. When I was, as I mentioned last year, I was in IT for a while and working for a hospital, and that's the time that I was approached about being in the full-time ministry, and I had to make a choice. And I will tell you that my choice was based on purpose, because I knew that ultimately, as I've said before, Microsoft may end up controlling the world, but they don't win in the end. We might say Google today. They may be all powerful, maybe great companies to work for, and I think they would be. But in the end, Christ returns. And in the end, there's a great mission that He's trying to accomplish. And I just felt that being a part of helping people make it to the kingdom, attain their ultimate purpose, I felt that would be more satisfying than studying computers. And I've not regretted that choice, but I made the choice based on what I believed my purpose was and how to connect with that deeper purpose. Now, we all have the opportunity of doing that. That's why we give so much. I mean, brethren within God's church serve one another, serve in various capacities. We show up. Sometimes, I don't know about here yet, but I know in Fargo, almost everyone, except one or two, would drive 3.5, 4 hours to get to church every Sabbath, 3.5, 4 hours to get home. And they do that because of their purpose. They want to be with people who have that same purpose. They want to be with God's people. And it drives them. And they willingly do it because of that purpose. And they serve. They give of themselves because they know it means something to God's people. It means something to God. And they are driven by that sense of purpose. But as I said, we can't look in ourselves and find our ultimate purpose. We can look in ourselves and find our aptitudes, our interests, things that might make us happy to do, but not our ultimate purpose, because we did not create ourselves. Only the Creator can assign purpose. So let's go back to Genesis chapter 1, and we'll see God doesn't say, okay, Adam, this is your purpose. He didn't use those words. But He did give Adam purpose. And we see that. Genesis 1, and we'll pick up in verse 25, Genesis 1, verse 25. Where it says, "And God made the beasts of the earth according to its kind, cattle according to its kind, and everything that creeps on the earth according to its kind." So we have a theme there, everything according to its kind. "And God saw that it was good. Then God said, 'Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness.'" So here we have something that gives us a very big clue. As I said last week, even our identity. Our identity and our purpose. Some people conflate them together. I believe that they are connected, but they're not exactly the same thing. But here he says, we are created in the image of God. We are of the God kind. We talked about that last week, and we'll mention again some more here. The children of God. That's what we have been given the opportunity to be. We are of the God kind. And that means we must have some kind of purpose that's related to God. And we know, because we read the scriptures, that God is creating a family. God wants to bring us into that family. He wants to give us eternal life and spend that eternity with us. God has a purpose in creating us. It wasn't just to create us and mess around with us. My little almost 2-year-old grandson likes to play with ants. And he'll go across the room if he sees an ant. And he's got very good eyesight compared to me. If he got an ant, he'll play around with it. And I used to do that as a kid. I remember playing with ants. I remember, well, I shouldn't tell you what I did with ants. Cruelty to ants. But, God doesn't just mess around with us like we're little ants. Like He created us just to be entertained by us or to watch kind of what we do, like you might watch an ant farm. No, God created us because He wants to be with us. He wants us to join Him in what He's doing eternally. And so He has a purpose for creating us. And that's not something we can define by looking inside. It's only something we can find out from God's revelation. But notice He goes on to say, according to our likeness, "Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, over the cattle." This idea of dominion, of, you might say, ruling, or you might say caring for, taking care of something. Adam and Eve from the very beginning was to care for the garden. He gave them a job to do, and that job, interestingly, implied leadership, leading. And I think that's interesting as well. Again, He doesn't say your purpose is, but He certainly gives them the idea that they are to be His family, His kind, and you are to have dominion. I'm going to use you as leaders. Work with you in that way. We know from 1 John 3, verse 1, if you want to turn over 1 John 3, verse 1. Again, we touched on this last week as well. 1 John chapter 3. And verse 1. It says, "Behold, what manner of love the Father has bestowed upon us, that we should be called the children of God." It is an act of love, God's love toward us, that He has made us His children. So again, He's growing a family. He has a purpose in creating us. We could go back again to Hebrews chapter 2, verse 9. We were there last Sabbath. Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 9. Hebrews 2 verse 9 says, "But we see Jesus, who was made a little lower than the angels for the suffering of death, crowned with glory and honor, that He, by the grace of God, might taste death for everyone. For it is fitting for Him, for whom are all things and by whom are all things, in bringing many sons to glory, to make the captain of their salvation perfect through suffering." Notice that statement, in bringing many sons to glory. So we are children, but what is our destiny? What is our ultimate purpose? What does God want us to become? He wants us to become glorious. Sons to glory. Now, what do you think of when you think of glory? I remember Moses asking, we talked about that already too, Moses asking God to show Himself. Of course, God couldn't show Himself in all His brilliance and brightness and glory, because Human couldn't take that. It's just too much. Too much glory. So he had to be shielded from that. What do you think of when you think of glorious? If you turn back to 1 Corinthians 15, 1 Corinthians 15 is, as we call it, the resurrection chapter. I want to read a little bit at the end of it. There's certainly much more here that we could get into that we won't take the time today, but we get the gist of what Paul is trying to tell us. It says in 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 40 and the scriptures that follow, there are also celestial bodies or heavenly bodies, and there are terrestrial bodies or earthly bodies. But the glory of the celestial or the heavenly is one, and the glory of the earthly is another. There is one glory of the sun, another glory of the moon, another glory of the stars. For one star differs from another star in glory. And he says, so is the resurrection from the dead. The body is sown in corruption, it's raised in incorruption. Now, what's he getting at here? He's, I believe, pointing to the idea of, we look up at the stars and we really don't see them in their fullness as if we were closer to them, but we can see the sun, and that's the most glorious light in the sky. It's so glorious, we can't even look directly at it. It'll blind us. So God didn't just give us light, He gave us a brilliant light that is so glorious, it's so magnificent that we can't even behold it completely. And that's just an earthly example. I think Paul is, by the inspiration of God, trying to give us an idea, a glimpse of what glory may be. Now, we, of course, look out at the stars, and we know some of those stars make our sun look like nothing. We know that today because we have telescopes and things like that, and we can see how big some of these things are. And to us, the sun may look glorious, but those things make the sun look like a dot, just a period at the end of a sentence. Wow, there is glory. That is glorious. But you know what? That's still physical. That's still physical. But I think it's interesting that God has given us examples in these celestial bodies to give us an idea of just maybe a glimpse of what it would be like to be glorious, to be so beyond what we are now that it's almost incapable of imagining it. And I see that as glory. I see whatever I can conceive of as glory, as the glory that you and I will have as spirit beings. It doesn't come close to the reality. That's the way I look at it. Because again, I see this example of celestial bodies. When we look out and see a star, we think, oh, it's a little star. We imagine it's a little star, but it's not. It's a huge star, or an entire solar system. So what we can see and what we think we imagine about being glorious probably, as I said, just touches the surface. That is what God has for you and I, for you and me, to be glorious. That is a tremendous purpose. But you know what bothers me about that is that it could be very easy for me to see that purpose in a selfish way. Yeah, I want to be glorious. Yeah, I like that idea. Stand around heavens and shine like the sun. Yeah, I like that. And I have to make sure that I remember that, yes, I do want glory. I can imagine how it's going to feel to be a spiritual being. I would love that. I want that. But at the same time, I have to keep in mind that there's another aspect of our purpose. It's not just being glorious. It's to be glorious and fulfill a purpose at the same time. That purpose, I think, is we can't get around the fact that what is God? If we are going to be in the God family, if we're going to be of His kind, what is He? Well, we know He's spirit, and sometimes it's easy to focus on the fact that we'll be spirit beings. But we also know, you know what I'm going toward here, God is also love. We will be loving beings, and that means we won't just be standing out there as spirit beings, say, look how glorious I am. We will be doing something to serve God, to serve one another, to serve whatever it is that God has in our future. I remember thinking, even as a teenager, what happens beyond the great white throne of judgment? What happens beyond the New Jerusalem? God doesn't tell us. But boy, what He does tell us is there's magnificent things We are told, Moses tells us, not to worship the stars because that is our heritage. And there's going to be a new heaven. And we think this heaven is amazing and awesome. Think about the new heaven. What God has beyond that, we don't know yet, but it will be amazing. It has to be amazing. Because why would Christ have wanted to go back to it if it wasn't? He lived, he died. If it wasn't something he really wanted to go back to, he could have been born as a baby, grow up, and say, God, I know what you have for me, but I'm done with that. I think I'll just live my life the way I please. I'll die. I'll be forever dead. I won't be resurrected because God did resurrect Christ. He was dead 3 days and 3 nights, but then he was resurrected. Christ lived a life of perfection for us, and he wanted to go back to where he was, and he wanted us to join him. And I believe if it wasn't that great, why go through the trouble? Why go through the trouble? I think it is going to be a wonderful thing, but it's wonderful because of the character of love. It's not wonderful, I don't think, to Satan and the demons. Can't imagine that being a fulfilling, enjoyable anything, except to just get what they want in life. But with God and being a God being, we will have love. We will have that which ultimately brings joy. And love is not something that we have, it's something we do for others. It is an action word. It's not something we feel, it's something we do for others. And therefore, I see us having a purpose that's very selfless. Yes, it involves glory. It's going to be wonderful, but it's going to be very selfless in nature. And thinking about this idea of purpose and selflessness, I remembered that Simon Sinek, the author of The Start With Why, he had told a story, and I'd seen his YouTube video about a year ago maybe on this. He tells the story of the Wright brothers, and I thought it was very interesting because of the way he portrayed them in their pursuit of manned flight. He talked about another fellow you've probably never heard of unless you've read about this particular story, Samuel Pierpont Langley. Samuel Pierpont Langley was given $50,000 by the War Department to develop a flying machine. And this Langley had a seat at Harvard. He worked for the Smithsonian. As said, he's very well-connected. Sinek said he's very well-connected. He had access to the best minds of his day. He could hire people, pay a lot of money to have them help. The New York Times followed him everywhere. Everyone's rooting for Langley to make this flying machine. While at the same time, Sinek says that at the same time, a few hundred miles away in Dayton, Ohio, Orville and Wilbur Wright had none of what was considered, he says, the recipe for success. They had no money. They had to pay for their dream with the proceeds from their bicycle shop. Not a single person working with them had a college degree. Neither one of them had a college degree either. The New York Times followed them nowhere. The difference was, as Simon Sinek says, he says the difference was that Orville and Wilbur were driven by a cause, by a purpose, and by a belief. They believed that if they could figure this flying machine out, it would change the course of the world for the better. They could do something that would really contribute to the world, whereas Langley wanted to be rich and famous. When Langley heard that these two brothers had invented flight, he quit. He didn't attain the title he wanted of first, and perhaps he thought there was no more money involved. And so he quit. He could have said, hey, let's take this and make it better, because he was a man who could have made it better. But he quit because his purpose wasn't right. It was selfish from the way that the story is described. But the two Wright brothers, they felt that they could do something. They felt they had a purpose. They had a mission that could help other people. And that really was the right motive. And I believe that is the motive that we simply have to have if we are to be motivated properly, if we are to be driven by the right purpose, it's not just a self thing. It's not that I want to feel fulfilled or I just want to be in the kingdom. It's got to be right together with the idea of love one another, giving to others, helping others have a better life. And that's what I think we read when we go to some of the scriptures in Revelation that give us our purpose as well. If you go to Revelation 1, verse 6, again, we often turn to these scriptures in relation to this, but it shows us that we're going to have a purpose that's not just self-oriented, it's to serve, it's to help others. And Revelation 1, verse 6 says, "And has made us kings and priests to his God and Father. To him be glory and dominion forever and ever. Amen." We read these scriptures. We are going to be kings and priests. Revelation 5:10, another big one that you may have marked in your Bible. Revelation 5, verse 10, "And have made us kings and priests to our God, and we shall reign on earth." We've always seen that we're going to have responsibility on earth, not in heaven, but on earth. And we learn from Revelation 20, verse 6. If you turn back to Revelation 20, verse 6, another component of this purpose that we have. Revelation 20, verse 6, "Blessed and holy is he who has part in the first resurrection." That is the church, God's church today. "Over such the second death has no power, but they shall be priests of God and of Christ and shall reign with him 1,000 years. So we know that that millennial period is a time where God is going to use us. So that's another aspect of our purpose. We exist to be glorified in God's family. Our purpose today, why we sit here today, is to be prepared for God to use us in the millennium. And as I mentioned in my Sabbath note, I think that's going to be a tremendous opportunity for all of us. Even as a young person, it was something I envisioned. What would it be like to be a king and priest? What would it be like to not just rule, but to help people find happiness, fulfillment, to help people understand their purpose in life? What would it be like to be able to go around and heal people? I was in a club, exercise place a few years ago, and I paid to swim so I could get in the sauna. Up north, we have to pay to get in the sauna. We just walk outside here, and we've got our sauna. But I swam for the reward of getting in the sauna. And I was in there by myself, and they rolled, a little fellow rolled in, must have been about 12 years old. They rolled him in his wheelchair, and he was sitting right in front of me, and the attendant walked out, and we said hello, and I got to thinking, what if I could reach out and heal him? I don't know that I can't, because God might honor that. This is what's going on in my head. God might honor that. If I have faith, I can just reach out and heal him. Then I got to thinking what he might think if I reach out and touch him. It wouldn't turn out good, probably, so I didn't make the attempt. But, this is not the time where God is... we're not going out healing everybody. It's not that time yet. But I look forward to the time when we can. It's going to be an amazing experience to change people's lives. But, God has a plan, and we have to patiently wait for it to develop. And that's what we are doing. But God is taking action now in preparing each of us. No matter what it is we do, no matter what career we're in, God is using that to prepare us for that purpose that he has. And that's a wonderful thing to think that God has that kind of attention for us. And that's why sometimes we're learning to grow in the fruits of the Spirit. Love, joy, peace, long-suffering, all these things. We have to analyze ourselves. Are we becoming that way? Because that's the kind of king and priest God wants. And this is our training ground so that we can be a part of changing that world. There's a name that I'm sure most of you have heard of before. In fact, if you read our Life, Hope, and Truth article on the purpose of life, I'm fairly sure that's the one that mentions the name of Viktor Frankl. And some of you have probably read his book, And he talks about man's search for meaning. He was a survivor of the Holocaust. He spent time in concentration camps. Auschwitz is one of them. And he realized that to get through that trial, that ordeal, the key was finding meaning, purpose, even in suffering, in that terrible environment. Even then, he realized that, and especially then, he realized that finding meaning and purpose, what he was going through, was the key. Now, he wasn't converted. He wasn't in God's church. He didn't talk about this ultimate purpose we are, but he recognized the importance of that concept. And he lost his wife. He lost his entire family in concentration camps. I was watching an interview that he gave back in 1977, an interview called A Man Alive. I don't know if that's the name of the program back then or what, but this is what he said, Viktor Frankl. He said, "The lesson one learns from Auschwitz and other concentration camps, in the final analysis, that those people who were oriented toward a meaning to be fulfilled by them in the future were the most likely to survive." Those people who were oriented toward a meaning to be fulfilled by them in the future, something they were going to do, they needed to do, they were the ones most likely to survive. And he says that they have confirmed this afterward. American Navy and Army psychiatrists interviewing Japanese prisoner of war camps, North Korean prisoner of war camps, says the orientation toward the future, toward a personal task waiting for them to be fulfilled in their future. That purpose, their lives had meaning. That is what caused them to survive. And the people who lost that sense of purpose and meaning gave up. They simply gave up. They didn't have the ability to go on. He even mentions that even if it's something as simple as a loved one that you want to see again, and you envision seeing again even that, to something that you can live for, and you can get through the worst of circumstances. I wonder what it will be like. We all wonder what it will be like in some of the times prophesied in the future. We know there is a great tribulation. We know there are troubling times ahead. How do we get through? How do we get through the troubles we have now? I mean, many people are suffering. After the sermon up in the north there in Huntsville, I was told of a death that just happened in Mexico, and a lot of the brethren are suffering and mourning. A young 23-year-old girl that died that was recently visiting the United States. It was just a sudden thing. She was engaged to be married, and so they're mourning that. And how do we get through things? How can we get through unless we have that sense of purpose? Even Viktor Frankl said this. I don't read it except to say that he found meaning in this. He said, if there is a meaning in life at all, there must be meaning in suffering. Here's someone who went through it, who saw it, the deaths of his family, who suffered himself. He said, if there's meaning in life at all, there must be meaning in suffering. He was able to find that. Often we ask why, and we know that ultimately God has the answers. But we also can take comfort in the fact that God has a purpose. And whatever happens, there's a purpose to it. There's something that will come of it that will fit right in with God's plan, His ultimate plan. I think that I don't subscribe to all Viktor Frankl's thoughts on things, but that concept of finding meaning in suffering, of having to have purpose to make it through things. We're going to need that. Sometimes we have to go back to our very meaning just to make it through the trials that we experience, even small trials. If we go back to that very core of what God is doing, what God wants to accomplish in me, what my future is, we have purpose, and that makes all the difference in the world. I will just end and conclude today with the idea of what kind of example did Christ set in terms of being driven by purpose? What kind of example did Christ set? There are a number of scriptures we could turn to, but I will just refer to one we've already referred to today, Hebrews 2, verse 9 and 10. You don't have to turn there, but it's where it says we see Jesus, who was made a little lower than the angels. Why? For the suffering of death. He knew that when he was made into a physical. He knew that part of the reason of his life was to suffer and die. But yet he was willing to do it. That was one of his purposes. And he knew it had to happen at the right time. So he orchestrated events through his ministry to make sure it happened when it needed to happen. He was motivated and driven and always kept in mind that purpose that God had sent him. Now, if you go back to John chapter 6, we see another example of what drove him and the sense of purpose that he had. John 6, verse 38. I ultimately think God's purpose ultimately is demonstrating love, that basic characteristic of who he is. But notice a more specific area here of how he did that. John 6, verse 38. For I have come down from heaven not to do my own will. I mean, self-help gurus today, that's exactly what they say. Find out what you want to do. Look inside yourself. Find your purpose. Well, he says, I didn't come with that in mind. He says, but to do the will of him who sent me. It was all about glorifying God, doing the will of God, and that was his purpose. And he was driven by that purpose. So driven that he became our Savior. And so driven by love that he wants to do that so that we can join him. He was driven. He says this, it goes on verse 39, this is the will of the Father who sent me, that of all he has given me I should lose nothing, but should raise it up at the last day. That's you. That's me. Christ is driven by a purpose to lose none of us. Now sometimes we go astray. Christ wants to come back. What can he do? What can we do? God, he doesn't want to lose any of us. And I think for that to happen, for us to honor God the Father and Jesus Christ as we should, for this to happen, that he doesn't lose us, even through the most difficult of times, purpose is that keen sense of purpose, that we know why we are and we know why we're here. If we have that, then it works wonders for us. I want to conclude by reading a quote. This is a quote by Rick Warren. He says, nothing matters more than knowing God's purpose for your life, and nothing can compensate for not knowing them. Not success, wealth, fame, or pleasure. Without purpose, life is motion without meaning, activity without direction, and events without reason. Without purpose, life is trivial, petty, and pointless. I hope that as we discuss this week and last, the importance of our identity, the importance of identity, both ours and God's, and the importance of our purpose, that we can always be ready to answer the why.